Welcome to Mating Matters. I'm Dr. Wendy Walsh with our producer, Brooke Peterson. And this is another bonus episode of Mating Matters while we're busy working on a fully produced one, getting all our interviews and sound together for the next couple of this season. Mating Matters is a podcast about the psychology of human mating as it relates to evolutionary psychology. Because I believe that we've pretty much evolved to do most things in our life, and the reason why most human behaviors exist is to increase our reproductive odds. And so there are all kinds of things that we do that are invisible, and we don't even realize that, not only our ways of relating to one another, but also some of our cultural systems were all designed to increase survival, but not just survival. I mean, survival means you get enough food and shelter during your lifespan. But if you fail to reproduce, then you don't get to stay in evolution's chain. So please know that you're here today because you have really smart ancestors who knew how to solve the biggest problem ever presented to humans, how to reproduce and make sure that those offspring survive to become healthy adults so they could reproduce, and so on and so on and so on. So I look at everything. I look at human behavior. I look at gender. I look at sexuality. I look at human mating strategy. And I look at competition for mates, female to female competition and male to male competition for mates. But today I want to talk about something that comes up a lot, which is nature versus nurture, and something I call intergenerational psychology. It's a question that people often email me about. They believe that I'm saying that biology is destiny, that how we have evolved to be, our mating strategies, the way that we survive and things that we do to survive is just that way because we've inherited it. Biologically, we've inherited it. So I wanted to take a moment to remind everybody about the nature versus nurture debate. There is no debate. It's always both. In other words, we all come into the world with a genetic predisposition to behave in certain ways, to have certain kind of health risks, to grow a certain height or not. And then our environment either suppresses or enlivens those genes. So let's say you were born with a gene that gave you a predisposition for heart disease. However, you were born into a family who ate particularly healthy, mostly a plant-based diet, very little saturated fats and red meat and good fats. And you were born into a family that exercised a lot across the lifespan. That gene for heart disease might never get an opportunity to be expressed. On the other hand, you also could be born with a gene for fairly high intelligence. But in your early life, especially in the first year of life when the brain triples in size, if the environment isn't stimulating that, when there's a lot of blooming and pruning going on in the brain as it's trying to figure out which neurotransmitters it needs for survival, if adults aren't talking with you, if you've been stuck in front of a screen watching shows and it's not interactive, nobody's reading to you, then your high intelligence might not be expressed. So it's always nature versus nurture. But get this, it's not just you and your experiences. But remember, you come from a long line of ancestors who may have had trauma themselves that actually altered their genes. An area of psychological research that I am currently fascinated with is called intergenerational psychology. It includes the idea that our emotional responses to pain and suffering, and nobody gets out here easy. Trust me, nobody has an easy life. The idea that our responses to pain and suffering can actually be transmitted genetically. I like to call it ancestor trauma. I mean, as I've just explained, our genes are loaded guns. They're loaded guns for physical ailments like heart disease, as I mentioned, and cancer. And they're also loaded guns for mental illness. Schizophrenia has a genetic link, for instance. But what about run-of-the-mill anxiety and depression? Could our roots of our fears and our sometimes wacky responses to stress, actually lie with our ancestors? I think the answer is yes. Interestingly enough, most of the research to date on intergenerational transmission of personality traits and psychology has been done on worms, mice, and rats, of course, because they reproduce so quickly. But there's one human study done of Holocaust survivors and their children, and I think this gives us some interesting insight. A team at New York's Mount Sinai Hospital looked at the genes of 32 Jewish women and men who had been imprisoned in World War II concentration camps. Many of them had been tortured. Many of them had lived in fear for years while they were in hiding. Then they analyzed the genes of their children, now adults living in the United States, who had never, ever seen a war zone. And what the researchers found was interesting. They actually found genetic changes in the gene that produces and monitors stress hormones. This is important because this gene influences how we react and cope with stress. There have been studies on mice, one study in particular, where they induced stress in pregnant female mice. I know, awful, right? And what they found is the daughters of these mice got through the maze, ran the tracks, were able to procure food for themselves, were pretty functional. But the gene lay in waiting to become enlivened in the next generation. And it was the granddaughters of those mice that exhibited a host of mental disorders. So while genetic transmission of trauma is, of course, one piece of intergenerational psychology, a family system's emotional communication, or lack thereof, finally closes the deal. This is how you come into the world with a genetic predisposition, and your family of origin, your first family, triggers that gene to work or not. And this is the clever beauty of nature versus nurture. It's always both. Our environment works to suppress or enliven our genes. And I think this is especially true when it comes to ancestor trauma. Here in the United States, we are a country of immigrants. We are a country of racism. We are a country, as many countries are, of patriarchal authority and disadvantage for women. And our ancestors often had it worse than we did. And in some ways, we carry the bed of their trauma. We carry this trauma in our genes waiting to be free and enlivened. It's interesting because sometimes our parents and grandparents might dismiss or minimize the trauma they experienced, but at the same time, they could give emotional cues to their kids or grandkids. You know, grandmothers say, be careful, the world is unsafe, be careful, don't do it. And that trauma eventually gives birth as unexplained anxiety or depression or poor coping mechanisms for stress, or the big one, big-time relationship problems. Before I give you some new research on resiliency, again, biology is not destiny. You may be the generation that makes the change for future generations. Let me quote a couple studies that we will give you the links to these studies in our what, Brooke? In our description. One is called Non-Genomic Transmission Across Generations of Maternal Behavior and Stress Responses in Rats. In this particular study, the researchers were able to determine, looking at multi-generations of female rats and their offspring, that there is definitely a cause between maternal behavior, motherhood, and how we treat our kids, and stress reactivity in offspring. And here's the interesting thing. That transmission of these, what we call individual differences in maternal behavior from one generation to another, continues on. However, these research findings indicate that variations in maternal care, meaning you can do something different, can serve as change, can make change. Another study looks at health, called Biological Pathways for Historical Trauma to Affect Health. And basically, the researchers looked at historically subjugated populations. And what they found is that lower socioeconomic status and trauma in generations shows up in poorer health outcomes when you compare it with the general population or the privileged population. So this theory basically says that the collective trauma of our ancestors negatively impacts the well-being of future generations. So they're basically saying it changes the genes. Then they're also saying that personal exposure to trauma or stressors, what happens to you in this generation, can create what we call epigenetic modifications that can contribute to the development of poor health. So, trauma changes genes, creates a higher stress response, makes people sicker, and also affects future generations. And so I say, if trauma can affect physical health, and we know that it can, why not mental health? And why not our relationships? Because relationship skills are partly taught, and they're partly inherited through our personalities. The kind of partners we choose, the kind of conflict style that we have available to us, the tools that we have available in our relationships came to us quite honestly through what we witnessed as children and what exists in our DNA. And so relationships are very, very complicated. It would be wonderful to say, there's just one succinct theory. This is what love is. And if you listen to my podcast episode called What is Love, you can hear some of those theories. John Bowlby's attachment theory, Sternberg's triangular theory of love. But there's also this idea that we inherit ways to love. And, I always remind people with relationships that every relationship is a growth potential for us. It's a gymnasium for our minds. And we should never, ever regard any relationship as a failed relationship. It's an opportunity for growth. I don't like it when people rate relationships based on duration, or they rate people based on number of relationships or number of sexual partners. We have to get rid of this whole terminology and instead just understand that we have been given a certain set of biological tools. We're heading out into the world where we meet another person who's got their own set of biological tools, and then we enter a psychological relationship system that we learned somewhere, and it might not be so functional. So I want you to forgive yourself about what's been going on with relationships and also understand that there may be history in your ways. One of my favorite metaphors for how relationship skills are intergenerational. It's a cute little story. Our daughter is preparing a ham for a holiday, and she calls her mother and says, "How do I make the ham?" And the mother says, "Well, first you cut it in half." And the daughter says, "Why?" And she goes, "I don't know. My mother always did it that way. It's important for it. You got to cut it in half." So she cuts it in half. She's still curious. So she decides to call the grandmother and say, "Grandma, why do you cut the ham in half? How does it make it better, cook it better?" The grandmother says, "I don't know, because my mother always did it that way. It's a family tradition, and this is the way we do it." So the granddaughter decides, I'm going to go to the old age home. I'm going to see great grandma, and I'm going to ask her about this ham story. So she goes to the room. She sees the old lady in her bed. She walks in, and she says, "I just want to know why we cut the ham in half." And the great-grandmother says, "Oh, it was because my pan was too small. It would never fit." You see, some behaviors were functional for one generation, but they don't belong here today. And some of our basic habits we inherited, but we don't need to use today. This is how intergenerational psychology works. Ask yourself, are you living out your ancestors' trauma? And if so, what are you doing about it? How do you process the grief of an ancestor you've never heard of? How do you, with your modern brain, make sense of it? Here are a few of ideas I have for you. First, explore your family history. Get the full story. Use Ancestry.com. Talk to any old person that you're faintly related to about what went on. Because what you're doing is you're creating a narrative for your feelings. When you hear those stories from the past, when you read historical literature about what your ancestors must have encountered during a certain time, you're now going, now I know why I feel this way. I call it genetic memory. And you have to have a narrative for genetic memory. Secondly, you know I love dreams. Freud called them preconscious material, just ready to be pricked and knocked to our consciousness so we can deal with it. Pay attention to your dreams. Keep a dream journal. It's there in your DNA, and the stories will show up from your unconscious in your dream life. Third, if you are going through an identity crisis, I want you to respect that crisis. Untangling a family's emotional past might mean breaking codes of silence, and this may alienate you from the family. You know, a child sometimes speaks of the unspeakable when parents and grandparents could not, and this rattles people. There may be a period of separation and loss while you create a new self-identity based on a healed narrative. Okay, the fourth bit of advice has to do with really reframing things, changing your perspective on things. Imagine if you could think of yourself as the chosen one, the one who was born with genes for a little more sensitivity, for intuition, for more emotional intelligence. You know, family systems therapy works like this. Usually when a family comes into therapy, they don't look 4 generations before them for the source of their troubles that created the unfair family system. They instead point to usually one member. We call it the identified patient. And they will say, fix this person, you know, this kid who's using drugs, this mom who's the alcoholic, or this dad who's the workaholic, right? Fix this person, and then our family will be okay. But remember, it was the family that created that person because of the system and how they worked. So if you're the one who is feeling more troubled, find strength in that. Know that you've been, I believe, chosen to be the one to do the emotional work for the whole family. If you are suffering from unexplained anxiety and depression, and you do take the time to delve into your ancestral past, interview all the old relatives that you can find, you might also dig up a treasure trove of interesting facts, not just the trauma, but the great things that happened in generations before you. So I really encourage you to look to intergenerational psychology as a sign of strength. When I found out that my grandmother, for instance, was born on a rock in the North Atlantic, the daughter of a lightkeeper with 13 kids, and was sent off in a rowboat at the age of 10 to be a washer girl, laundry girl to a wealthy family on the mainland so that she could survive because her dad died, and then immigrated to Canada at the age of 24, alone on a boat with an icebreaker on the front, I thought to myself, that tough woman's inside me. Wow, that's pretty cool. So take the time to do the research and know that the good and the bad is inside you, but you have the intelligence to process it and the emotional sensitivity to help your entire family. I want to close by simply saying, go forward. Know that your conscious mind will never allow you to feel what you can't handle. You got this. Mating Matters is produced in partnership with iHeartMedia. It is researched, interviewed, and written by me, Dr. Wendy Walsh, and it is edited and produced by Brooke Peterson. You know, people don't learn about podcasts usually by just searching around. They learn about a podcast because somebody who loved that podcast told them about it. So I encourage you to please subscribe, write a review, and more than anything, hit that share button now. Think of somebody who would like to hear this information as much as you enjoyed it. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram at Dr. Wendy Walsh. Listen to Mating Matters on the iHeartRadio app or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thanks for listening. I'm Dr. Wendy Walsh.